those are the stalwarts that seem to have survived over 70 years of an Israeli political dynamic. And I don't think Labor is going to disappear. I think they will make the electoral threshold. But when you think about a party that dominated Israeli politics for the first 29 years of its existence, and we're even talking about whether or not it crosses that threshold, that's incredible. Because alongside their hegemony of the center-left, you've had a lot of pretenders and a lot of episodic parties. I mean, Tommy Lapid, Yair Lapid's father, came into the Knesset one time with 19 votes. That's a lot. That's over 15% of the seats in the Knesset. And then the next time he disappeared. Kadima, which was huge, and sort of much more recently, had 29 votes at the high when Tzipi Livni, and they were projected to get over 40 before Sharon suffered a stroke. So, and they're gone. They disappeared. They, recreated themselves as Chatznua for one go around, and now they're gone from the political map. So I think that the Israeli electorate is going to have clear choices. I think it's much less likely that fringe parties forming a coalition are going to be able to hold hostage a coalition's ability to function, to govern. So I see these consolidations, aggregations, mergers as being quite positive, and I think that it's going to make handicapping the political landscape a little bit easier, and I'll share more about that in 2 weeks. This week, and this is maybe a segue, we can celebrate the fact that we can even have that discussion that we'll be having 2 weeks from now, that there is a political process, that there are parties, that these are fair, open, transparent elections. People are going to fight viciously. There's going to be vitriol from all sides, and the stakes are real. The direction of a country that we all care about is going to be determined to some extent by the future leadership, or the perpetuation of the current leadership, and probably a slightly different constellation. But we have free and fair elections. Nowhere else in the neighborhood do we have that. And when we put together the curriculum, one thing that was clear to me 6 months ago now nearly was that Syria is serious. And I mentioned in a previous class that since I've been politically sentient, there's never been one country that has been a flashpoint for so much consequential conflict that I can think of. Every single major character on the global stage is somehow engaged in Syria, and a lot of powers that we'll talk about sequentially are consumed and obsessed with Syria. So, well, again, let's take a look, a bit of history. So those of us who are closer to Israel and think of Israel first when we think of the Middle East, recognize that historically Israel sits at a crossroads of Asia, Africa, Europe. When you had the traders of years ago go from east to west, many of them migrated through Israel, through what's now Israel, but as many of them migrated through what's now Syria. My point being that part of the Levant has certainly been as much fought over as Israel was. We just don't learn about it in Hebrew school. But if you look historically, that part of this region has always been a target of large empires vying for control. If you go back to the Greeks and the Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans, and the Ottomans. So the Ottomans controlled Syria through World War I. And last week we talked a little bit about anti-Semitism and Ptolemy in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, and Antiochus, the famous king who defiled the temple and catalyzed the revolt of the Maccabees. They call him a Greek in the story, but he was a Syrian king. So to begin to understand the conflict in Syria today, we got to go back to something that I think I talked about last year quite a bit. That's the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So Sykes-Picot was an agreement signed between the French and the English in 1916 in the middle of the First World War, then called the Great War. And a lot of things were happening simultaneously. So a lot of promises were made that couldn't be kept because those promises were in direct contradiction to one another. So you had McMahon, who was a British Foreign Secretary, exchanging letters with Hussein, promising the Arabs an independent sovereign state in exchange for their cooperation against the Turks during the war. And then you have Sykes-Picot, which basically didn't have any regard for these side deals and basically took a crayon and redrew the maps of the Middle East in a way that you'd actually punish your kids if they did that, but more importantly, it had zero regard for the tribal realities on the ground. And so the mischief that was created 103 years ago is coming back to roost. So what happened after the League of Nations convened and San Remo conference divvied up the territory, France got Syria. France got what's now Syria and Lebanon. Britain got Mesopotamia, Palestine, Iraq, and Palestine. And the Arabs revolted. The Arabs revolted primarily against the French. Hussein, by the way, at San Remo actually exchanged a correspondence with Weizmann because they both realized, remember, so the Arabs had their Hussein-McMahon correspondence. We had the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour Declaration was a seminal document as far as Jewish nationalism in connection to Jewish Zionism is concerned. And it was completely upended by Sykes-Picot, completely upended by the San Remo conference, and it was shelved. So Weizmann and Hussein tried to cobble together an alliance to sort of remind the great powers that they had made these representations to these respective putative beneficiaries in the middle of the war, and it was all for naught. So you now have the French controlling Syria. There's a rebellion. It's put down very quickly, and there is a series of these. And again, during the Ottoman Empire, the whole region was divided into these vilayates. You had the vilayet of Damascus, the vilayet of Aleppo, the vilayet of Jerusalem, the vilayet of Jaffa. So little, basically provinces. So there wasn't this territorial contiguity. So it wasn't like, okay, so Syria once belonged to the Syria that we know, it once belonged to the Greeks, then it belonged to the Romans, then it belonged to the Ottomans, and then it didn't belong as a consolidated entity to anybody. So when the French came in, and there was a vilayet of Lebanon. So Syria comprised 6 of these Ottoman vilayets. The vilayet of Lebanon was one, and it was controlled by the Maronite Christians. So it was sort of it was still controlled by the Ottoman Muslims, but the Christians had some autonomy in Lebanon. And the composition of what's current day Syria was a very broad mixture of different tribes. Most of them Muslim, Shia, Sunni. Some of them, Druze and Alawites are sort of, they share a lot with Muslims. We have a lot of Muslims to tell you I'd call them the Muslim Mormons, if you will, that they're considered a little bit off by the mainstream Muslims, to the extent that that's a term we can use. You also had Circassians who were moved by the Russians from the Caucasus. The rebellious Circassians were population transfers, as we talked about in the last class, were extraordinarily common, and therefore a lot of these nations that suffered their own version of anti-Semitism didn't suffer it for very long because they just disappeared. So there was nobody left to hate. The Jews lasted for much longer, and that's why it's one of the reasons why anti-Semitism persists. But so you have this mixture of all these many tribes and communities in one country, and they get sovereignty in 1923 after the League of Nations. Run by the French. They finally get their autonomy in 1946, right after which is one of the reasons why the Jews in Palestine were agitating so much, because the French essentially gave Lebanon and Syria autonomy, political autonomy in 1946, whereas the British did not leave Palestine until 1948, as we know, but they didn't even put the question to the United Nations until the beginning of 47. When you had UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, which culminated into the famous vote on November 29th. But that's Israel's history. Syria is now vying for its role in an Arab world. And without getting too much into the interstices of the fight between the Hashemites and the sort of Hussein, basically the House of Hussein and the House of Saud, they basically kicked the Hashemites out of the Hejaz, which is now mostly Saudi Arabia, but think about it as a lot of the Gulf, what's now the GCC, and we'll talk about those countries obviously because they're very important. But when we think about Israel and the Arabs, and we talked about the prism of looking at the Middle East from Foggy Bottom, I mean from the State Department, and you have one little Jewish country and 23 Muslim countries, and they're all hostile to the little Jewish country. Within the Middle East, you've had massive dysfunction forever. There's never been, so it's not a one little country against lots and lots of coordinated, consolidated other countries. Those countries were never countries. The Western notion of sovereignty and rule over people by either authoritarian dictators, tribal leaders, presidents, prime ministers, whatever you want to call them, this is all an extremely new concept to the Middle East. So it was a failed experiment so far in introducing what the West took for granted, and nobody could have or should have predicted that this was going to work, and it's not working. It actually, if you look at the Middle East today, it's completely dysfunctional. And Syria is the example that I chose because it's, on the one hand, the most complex, but also the easiest to understand, because there are really just so many different tribes that have historically been vying for control over this extremely attractive region. So fast forward, in 1963, you have a secular takeover of Syria. The Ba'ath Party takes over, but even within that, and the Muslims reacted horribly. There were riots, but those riots were put down. The military increasingly became ruled by the secularist Ba'ath Party. Then one of the generals, Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president of Syria, takes over in 1970, and he basically makes the entire Syrian leadership Alawites, which at the time represented about 11% of the Syrian population. Now it's 15, not because they're having more kids, but because a lot of non-Alawites have been leaving Syria. We'll get to that in a second. So, representing about 10% of the population, controlling everything for 30 years. From 1970 to 2000, Hafez al-Assad ruled Syria with an iron fist. He, Tom Friedman wrote a book called From Beirut to Jerusalem, without getting into, Tom Friedman's politics. He did do what I thought was an excellent job in understanding how the tribalism in Lebanon and Syria really infected both those countries and regional politics. The book was written in the late 80s, and a lot has happened since then. But even before that, in 1982, which we remember as the year that Israel had to invade Lebanon, or chose to invade Lebanon, and deal with the PLO sort of takeover of that country after the Lebanese civil war, Assad was dealing with his own issues, and he basically destroyed an entire city, Hama, paved it over. I don't know, tens of thousands, if not more, people were killed. But that was amateur night compared to what his son has catalyzed in this past decade. So Syria, like Egypt, and then one of the things that happened after Hafez Assad took over, in order to burnish his credentials as a secular leader, he hooked up with Nasser. They formed the United Arab Coalition. The two countries were actually partners in a sovereign entity for 2 years. And then Syria took its place in the Arab League, got a lot of credit for its role in the Yom Kippur War, which was considered a victory. And then after 1982, began to flex its muscles. Today, when we think of Hezbollah in Lebanon, we think of an Iranian-backed militia that's designed to do a couple of things, including destroy the state of Israel. But Hezbollah was really empowered and created initially by the Syrians. Created initially by the Syrians in order to engage Israel in warfare that Syria would be able to do directly. So after the Lebanese vacuum was created in 1982, Hezbollah really took over and today effectively controls Lebanon and is extraordinarily active in Syria. And in order to make this easier to understand, I want to, in your own mind, to divide the actors that we're going to talk about in terms of regional powers and global powers. So the global powers are the United States and Russia, with China getting a little bit of an honorable mention, really an honorable mention, not a dishonorable mention. And then the regional powers are a little bit more obvious. And you've got Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Israel. So we'll talk about the outside powers later, although I think they're probably the most important. Let's talk about what Saudi Arabia wants in Syria, what Iran wants in Syria. And the reason I'm picking on those two first is because when I take my Israel hat off and think about the Middle East, the easiest way for me to understand the conflict in the Middle East is to think about these two great powers. Okay, because that's how the rest of the Middle East thinks about itself. The Israelis, the Palestinians don't really matter much to most folks when they wake up in the morning in the rest of the Middle East. It's really a battle between the Iranian Shia view of the world, the Saudi Arabian Sunni view of the world, and even that's not homogenous. In other words, it's not that all Shia think one way and all Sunni think another way. We'll talk about the intra-Sunni conflict in a second, and Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS, those are all Sunni actors and they're all fighting against each other. But if you think about what Saudi Arabia wants and what Iran wants, it'll be a lot easier, I believe, to understand what's going on in Syria. So each of them sees itself as a great power. The Saudis felt when they got their land, and then very shortly after, Saudi Arabia became an independent kingdom in 1932. Oil was discovered in 1936, and now suddenly everybody wants to be buddies with the Saudis. This was in tandem when the United States was, it was also already industrialized, but certainly the war effort, the post-war United States, very dependent on Gulf oil. So the Saudis, obviously, and Saudi Arabia, by the way, is also not an homogenous country. It has a very significant, it's a Sunni country, but it has a Shia minority, and the Shia minority geographically happens to sit on the east coast of the Persian Gulf, which is where most of the oil is. So if the Shia minority within Saudi Arabia became a separate entity, they would control over half the oil in the country. People don't appreciate that, but they don't. And these are big countries. To give you a sense of the population of the major countries we're talking about, the big three are Egypt, which now has close to 100 million people, Turkey and Iran. Iran has slightly over 80, Turkey probably has slightly below 80, but these are big countries, right? These are three times the size of Canada. But Iraq has over 30 million people. Saudi Arabia has close to 30 million people. Syria had close to 25 million people, now it's under 20, because over 5 million people have been displaced, over 500,000 people have been killed. There have been over 6 million people displaced internally within Syria, so if you think about it, about half the population has either been killed, displaced, or just left in less than 10 years. That's nearly unprecedented, and it's not a little country, it's a country, like I said, had 24 million people in 2011. So the Saudis, they feel Mecca and Medina, the two holiest, they're the defenders of the two holy mosques. This is the bulwark of the Muslim world. The Iranians feel differently. They got, you had ancient Persia, but they become a modern country also in the 30s. Islamist. The Americans want to protect the oil coming out of, and Persia was invaded many times by the Russians and the British. In the first part of the 20th century, Russia and Great Britain tried to take over Iran twice each. So this was a pretty attractive target for other powers as well. The CIA famously deposed Mossadegh in 1963 in a coup. They put in the Shah and made him a king. So now you got two kings. You got a king of Iran and a king of Saudi Arabia, and they hate each other. You have an Islamic revolution in 1979, and the Shah is gone. And Ayatollah Khomeini comes in, and he decides that this is now going to be an Islamic country, and the Saudis are petrified. They're absolutely petrified, because the same could happen there. So the Saudis then need to burnish their own Islamic credentials, and that's when they started to really increase their support for fanatical Wahhabi religious institutions in order to demonstrate to the rest of the Muslim world that they're no slouches when it comes to extremism. For those of you who've got a map of the Middle East in your head, and it might not be everybody in this room, you've got two giant countries with Iraq right in between. And Iraq was, at the time, led by Saddam Hussein. Once Ayatollah took over Iran, Saddam thought this was a soft target. And he thought he was just going to go and take Iran. And that's what he did in 1980. He invaded Iran, and the Iranians obviously didn't want to be invaded, and they fought an 8-year war with a lot of proxies there too. But and you know, the Iran-Contra. I mean, we can revisit the history. That conflict is relevant only in terms of how it really showed that I don't think either the Saudis or the Iranians wanted Iraq to disappear. So Saddam Hussein was a henchman. He was a bully. He was a horrible person. He gassed the Kurds, and the chemical weapons were used left, right, and center during that war. I think we looked at it as two countries that despise us, so let them kill each other, right? The more the merrier, and they had well over 1 million casualties. And obviously it's tragic from a human perspective, but I don't think in our insular community there was a lot of empathy generated for the antagonists in the war. And because you had a fundamental Islamic State fighting against an absolute dictator who had no regard even for large amounts of his own people. But so that war was essentially fought to a stalemate. It weakened both countries, but it weakened Saddam more. And then 2 years later, he goes and invades Kuwait. He wanted Iran for the oil, and then they have a very little port on the Persian Gulf in Basra, but Kuwait would have given him, more real estate on that very desirable Persian Gulf. Obviously, Iran would have given him more still. And so we know that story. So that caused Operation Desert Storm. The Americans came in with a very broad coalition that included Syria. But the Saudis and the Iranians have been fighting proxy wars ever since. They fight, every time you see a region that's in turmoil in the Middle East, look just a little bit more carefully, and you're going to find Saudi or Iranian fingerprints there. And sometimes they'll have boots on the ground, like the Iranians do in Syria or the Saudis do in Yemen, and sometimes they'll just be bankrolling other people with boots on the ground, like the Saudis are in Syria and the Iranians are in Yemen with the Houthis. But they're fighting proxy wars in Libya. They fought proxy conflicts in Tunisia. Certainly, since the removal of Saddam Hussein, they've been fighting proxy wars in Iraq. We'll end this lecture with Iraq, and I'll tell you why you ought to be paying attention to what happens in that country. And they're also fighting a big proxy war in Syria. In all of those other countries that I mentioned, they're the main actors. In Syria, they're not the main actors. They're actors. But what happened after Saddam Hussein was removed, and the American forces that toppled him might not have thought through carefully enough what the consequences of their actions might have been in 2003, 4, and 5, but they essentially threw out everybody that was associated with Saddam Hussein. Most of them Sunni, enabled the Shia to reassert themselves. They were suppressed historically in Iraq, and these Sunni combatants, well, they were combatants who fought and were paid for by the Iraqi army, inspired by Al-Qaeda and very antagonistic towards the Americans, started what began as a subgroup within Al-Qaeda and then became known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS or ISIL. That's been a story that we've all heard. They went on a rampage, and they conquered very impressive swaths of Iraq and then Syria. At one point, they controlled 1/3 of all of Syria. And they were extremely graphic in the way they treated foreigners, in the way they treated dissidents. They were proud of the videos they posted on YouTube, and essentially it was an in-your-face to the entire Western world. And the Western world reacted. So when ISIS claimed such a big part of Syria, that was one of the things that really enabled Assad to not look like such a bad guy. Because Assad was already butchering people, he was already using chemical warfare, but the only group in memory that I can think of that made Assad look not as horrible as he was ISIS. He wasn't beheading people on television. He wasn't posting, the burning of folks in cages on YouTube. And I remember, actually, we have some people here from Montreal, and we had every Yom Kippur, Stephen Lipper and colleagues put together a teach-in at the Shar Shemaim, and I was privileged to speak in 2013. And it was a few weeks after President Obama backed down from his red line on Syria. Chemical weapons would be a red line. He declared that in 2012. 2013, in August, they used chemical weapons. In September, they were going to go and have airstrikes. There was going to be a coalition of the United States, the UK, and France. The British House of Commons backed off, so Obama kicked it into Congress, and then the Russians stepped in and kind of, Lavrov, their foreign minister, and Kerry got together and decided, well, we're just going to have them get rid of their chemical weapons so we don't really have to do anything militarily. At that point, I said that I think that not only will Assad outlast Obama as a leader, but he will probably outlast his successor, whoever she or he was going to be. And I still think that's true. I think whether Trump serves 2 terms, and I think Assad is still going to be there for a very long time. I think that once the Americans blinked, and once the international coalition chose to direct its immediate priority against ISIS rather than against Assad, that enabled him to do what he's been doing for the past 5.5 years. And that is enable the other powers to get what they want in Syria. Most importantly, Russia. So we talked about Saudi Arabia and Iran. We talked about 2 other parties. We'll get to Egypt and Turkey are the 2 other regional parties. I haven't forgotten about them, but now I want to skip to Russia and the United States. So when all this fighting starts against Assad, right, let's go, how does it start as part of the Arab Spring? It's called the Arab Spring. So famously in December of 2010, a fruit merchant in Tunis, Mohammed Bouazizi, that's his name. Mohammed Bouazizi didn't get a permit, and like the monks in Vietnam, he self-immolates. He sets himself on fire as a protest, and that catalyzed a protest in Tunisia, which was run by Ben Ali for 32 years, and nobody thought, he didn't get as much airtime in the United States because Tunisia wasn't a country in conflict, and maybe not everybody in the room heard of him, but he was a henchman. He was one of these strong men who ran his own little fiefdom in the Middle East, and 8 days, he was gone. That inspired people in Egypt, and Libya, and Sudan, and Bahrain, and Morocco, and Jordan, and Yemen to do the same. And they did. Mubarak was gone in 3 weeks. Gone. Mubarak. You think about it, we're all old enough in this room to think of Mubarak, he's going to stay there until his son takes over, and then his son will take over. This guy's never leaving. He was gone 3 weeks. Yemen, same deal. Salah left. He made a deal. And that vacuum has obviously been a disaster. Gaddafi, gone. And then a few months later, found and killed. Different things happened in Bahrain. The Saudis stepped in to save again, it was a Shia uprising against the Sunni leadership, and the Saudis helped suppress that. Jordan, King Abdullah had to replace 4 governments in the space of 6 months because of protests that people would have never deigned to start then. Assad, it looked like there should be no reason for Assad to survive, where Saleh, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, Mubarak did not. There wasn't anything on the landscape, and you had real people there who were quickly assembling. The Free Syrian Army, the FSA was the first, and then the Kurds felt empowered, the YPG. You had a real groundswell of agitation against Assad. And I don't want to say he was saved by Al-Qaeda, by ISIS, but once ISIS decided to take advantage of Assad's weakness and creep into the country after what they did in Iraq, Other people paid attention. Once the Americans started to retreat, Russia came in, and what people need to remember is Russia is not what President Obama called a regional power. They certainly don't consider themselves a regional power. He had two comments that I think really, it's like when you're about to play another team in hockey, you don't want to call them sissies because they're just going to want to play better. So he called Russia a regional power. He called ISIS a JV military force, junior varsity, which means they're not really, you know, up to snuff. And I mean, in retrospect, he was probably right on both those things. Russia's not a global power. Russia is just able to play a very weak hand exceptionally well. And you know, the President Obama, for all of his strengths and weaknesses, I think got this one wrong. I think that when he famously told then Governor, now Senator Romney in a debate, you know, that Russia called, or no, sorry, the 1980s called, and they want their foreign policy back, sort of accusing the candidate of being sort of stuck in a very ancient mindset. It turns out that Romney's priorities, at least on that issue, were justified, because Russia was looking to reassert itself in the Middle East, demonstrate to the actors in the Middle East that it is a much more reliable partner, that it is not going to cut and run, that it is not going to pivot to Asia, and that the commitment is long-term. Now, Russia has, think about it, Russia is the largest country in the world by far in terms of size. It straddles 11 time zones. There are only 24. And Russia straddles 11 time zones. It's, when you think of Russia, I mean, you know, okay, you got the Baltic Sea, you got the Black Sea, you got the Mediterranean Sea, but Russia's not on the Mediterranean Sea. It's pretty close, but it isn't. You got Turkey and some other countries that are buffering it. It only has one port on the Mediterranean, and that's in Syria. That's, you know, the port in Tarsus. And it's got one air base in the region, that's in Latakia. In Syria. So it's extremely important, it's critical for the Russians to be able to maintain a military presence in the Middle East, and its only address was in Syria, and Assad was letting the Russians do what they were going to do, and for all the transformations, glasnost, perestroika, you know, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, for all the turmoil that was taking place there, the Syrians were extremely faithful to the Russians, never, you know, sort of bargaining for anything, always letting the Russians use Tarsus and Latakia for their naval and air bases. So it's payback time, and Putin comes in to reassert Russian power in the Middle East, and the Americans have made it easy for him, because President Obama didn't really want to be in Syria, and President Trump does not want to be in Syria. When President Trump announced at the end of last year that American troops are going to withdraw from Syria, I think everybody thought it was certainly very impulsive. He didn't tell anybody. Apparently he spoke to Erdogan, the Turkish president, and he said, you know, kind of be a good thing if you left. And he said, okay, fine, I'll leave. And James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, resigned, just flat out resigned. And I think it was a combination of content and process. I think that he thought that on the merits, the decision to withdraw from Syria was probably a mistake, if not, then certainly impulsive. And the process, he just wasn't told. I mean, you think if you're the Secretary of Defense and the President's going to announce that he's going to withdraw troops from a pretty critical part of the world, you don't do it on Twitter after speaking to the Turkish President. So, so he resigned, and the national security establishment was very disappointed. Israel was very disappointed, but the Turks were happy, the Russians were happy, the Iranians applauded the decision. So that ought to tell you that it probably wasn't exceptionally well orchestrated. I will tell you that if you looked at it strictly from a U.S. national interest perspective, remaining in places like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq forever carries its costs. I mean, we've seen in Iraq, we've seen in Afghanistan. In Syria, there really has been there have been very few American casualties. We haven't lost very much in terms of blood or treasure in Syria, but we haven't had that many troops. But those troops were pretty critical. They were critical for two key reasons, and they're still there. Now today, actually, they said they're going to keep 200 maybe out of 2,000, but the two main things that American troops are able to accomplish in Syria are, one, blocking that land bridge that Iran is desperate to build from Tehran to Beirut through Baghdad and Damascus, so Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and protect the YPG, protect the Syrian Kurds, who are they've been the most effective fighting force, certainly against ISIS, also against Assad. When the Russians came in 2015 to help take care of ISIS, most of what the Russians focused on was hitting anybody who threatened Assad. If it's ISIS, great, we'll hit them, and then we'll tell the Americans and the other people who don't like ISIS that we're fighting ISIS. But if it's the Kurds, they'll hit the Kurds. And this is where the Russian-Turkish alliance comes into play. And Turkey is now occupying about 10% of northwestern Syria. 10% of Syria in the northwest. If you look at, I got a map in my head, I don't have slides here, but Turkey has pretty much occupied the northwestern 10% of Syria. And that's where the YPG, that's where most of the Syrian Kurds live. The fear of Turkey, obviously, is its own Kurdish rebellion. So sometimes I take the Kurds, I think we all take the Kurds for granted, but I take for granted that people understand the whole Kurdish problem. The Kurds are kind of like the Jews, but they're just a lot more of them. There are 35 million Kurds, there are about 20 plus million just living in those four countries, Iran, Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. The Kurds were gassed by Saddam Hussein, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. They've never done particularly well in Iran. In Syria, they were fine. They were just like another one of these tribes that didn't have access to power, but wait in line next to the Druze and the Christians and the Circassians and everybody but the Alawites. But in Turkey, they've rebelled. The PKK has actually been labeled a terrorist organization by the United States. So the fear of the Turks is that the strengthening of the Kurds in Syria would then dribble over to the Kurds in Turkey and empower them. But if you actually took those four population centers of over 20 million people, and they're all geographically contiguous, you could create an independent state of Kurdistan, and just people don't think about it very much, but they have been extraordinarily reliable partners to the West for the past 20, 30 years. There are actually 200,000 Jewish Kurds living in Israel. I mean, there was a large Jewish population in those countries who none of them live there anymore. Obviously, think about maybe I don't think they're in Turkey either. I mean, they're Jews in Turkey, but not in that part. So now Turkey and Russia have this alliance, right? Turkey and Russia have this alliance vis-a-vis keeping Assad in power and therefore keeping the YPG down. Russia and Iran have an alliance in terms of keeping Assad in power. Israel is in a very uncomfortable situation. This is not something you're going to see on TV or read about in the newspapers, but all of this creates a huge problem for Israel because the Russians have put up with a lot of stuff. They know about it. But when you look, the United States is not. The United States and Israel are very closely aligned. You look at all the other powers that have bothered to get involved in Syria, including the Hezbollah, including Iran, including the YPG, including Jabal al-Nusra, including Al-Qaeda, including ISIS. None of these, all of them are anathema to Israel, but none of them worry Israel. None of them keep Israel up at night. None of them poses a military threat to it. Even Iran is a military threat that Israel believes it can contend with. Certainly, to the extent that it exists in Syria. It doesn't want to be more entrenched in Syria, but Israel has much better intelligence in that part of the world than the Iranians do, and they've just been taking pot shots at Iranian stuff. If you take the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Ramatkal, Gadi Eisenkot, who just retired a couple of months ago, he basically acknowledged that Israel has engaged in hundreds, if not thousands, of operations in Syria over the past 8 years. mostly against Iranian Hezbollah installations. But think about that, even just hundreds, that's a lot. And the Russians just tolerated it to a point. I think their breaking point, at least publicly, was when the Syrians shot down a Russian plane, but they blamed Israel because Israel had engaged in an operation and did not inform the Russians timely enough. So there was a Russian airplane in that space, and when the Syrian anti-aircraft battalions tried to engage the Israeli airplane, they shot down the Russian plane instead. Yeah, thank you. So if you look at Netanyahu's travel schedule, he's had meaningfully more trips to Moscow in the past few years than he's had to Washington. It is critical for him to have that open line with Putin. And, you know, Israel's a great country and it's got a lot of Russians, and the Russians are proud of that. And when Avigdor Lieberman was Minister of Defense, he could sit down in the Kremlin and speak to his counterparts in their native language, which has value. I'm not saying that tongue-in-cheek at all. It's for all of us who wind up in some place and whatever languages you speak, if you find somebody who unexpectedly can communicate with you flawlessly in whatever language you're most comfortable in, that has value. I mean, it takes the dialogue, takes the communication to a higher level. But substantively, you know, I think Russia recognizes that Israel does not want to see an Iranian presence in Syria, but it's not going to compromise its own priorities in order to enable Israel's. And its own priorities are Tarsus, Latakia, a regional presence, and its friendship with Assad. Now it has a good friendship with Israel too, but you know, I think the message to Israel is, yes, we understand that you don't want the Iranians on the Golan, and we'll understand if your attacks against the Iranians are limited in scope and targeted at you know, very clear, obvious threats to Israel. But that becomes harder to define. And then they're insisting on knowing about everything enough in advance so they can clear the space of their. It's not reciprocal, right? The Russians are not telling the Israelis when they plan on doing anything. And just keep this in mind, Russia is the Syrian Air Force, right? Assad has no Air Force. The Syrian Air Force, when Putin came in September 2015, he has provided all the air cover for whatever the Syrian army needed to do in terms of winning its own multiple battles against all these little fiefdoms. So, in my opinion, Assad is in Syria to stay. Russia is in Syria to stay. Iran is unfortunately in Syria to stay. The only question regarding the Iranians is to what extent their presence can be curtailed. In other words, how can they be kept in check so that they don't migrate south and that they don't develop rockets and weapon systems that are an even greater existential threat to Israel. Because remember, before all this nonsense started, we were talking about over 100,000 rockets that Hezbollah had in Lebanon, some of which could reach any target in Israel. So we have the Iron Dome. We've tested it. They're working on Arrow 1, Arrow 2. All of these are phenomenal air defense systems, but they can be overwhelmed, right? They can just be overwhelmed, and the costs are crippling, right? It costs. I mean, the sophisticated weapons are expensive, but the means to shoot them down are more expensive. So you can certainly, Hamas could cripple the country's economy if they launch thousands and thousands of rockets, which is why I think the genius of the mechanism is being able to detect the trajectory of the incoming, and that way you decide whether you even need to bother launching an interceptor, because if it's going to hit a field or like cows, but if it's not a real threat to human life, then they won't launch an interceptor, because these things, I mean, they're economies of scale, so maybe they're not as expensive, but they used to cost over $100,000 each. So, you launch several thousand of these, and that runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So coming back to Israel's apprehensions in Syria, I think that there's no easy answer here. And I think that that's one of the reasons why Israel very much wanted the Americans to retain a presence. So protecting the Kurds is important from a humanitarian perspective, but that's not so much what Israel cares about. The land bridge from Tehran to Beirut would be very inconvenient for Israel, because obviously that would enable the Iranians to transfer weapons into parts of the region, including Syria and Lebanon, that directly threaten Israel. But it's also very convenient for the Israelis. Israelis do not want foreign militaries on their own soil, but they're perfectly comfortable having foreign militaries in hostile places next door. So, this is way too much to cover in one class, but I want to mention a couple of other things and I'll take questions. So Turkey, we now understand what they want. And Turkey initially was very much about getting rid of Assad. They've reconciled themselves to Assad's presence, and so is the rest of the Arab world. I would not be surprised if Syria is welcome back, maybe not, but reintegrated into the Arab League, which is a big deal, because if you think about it, the entire Gulf was actively trying to get Assad removed. There was complete consensus that his time had come six or 7 years ago, and now they'll probably let him back in Syria, back into the Arab League. Saudi Arabia has, I think, overreached a little bit. I think the Saudis, especially once Trump became president, got a little bit arrogant. I think that they thought they could get away with more stuff. Even Saddam misread the Americans. I don't think that Saddam, after his saber rattling in Iran, he didn't think that the Americans would care if he took over Kuwait. And I don't think that the Saudis felt that they'd lose much if they detained the elite Saudi princes at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh for weeks to constrain entitlements, as it was euphemistically said. There's still entitlements. Princes can still live fat and happy off the land, but just not all of them. There were roundups of some female protesters. So MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who's essentially running the country, has declared that women should be able to drive, but they should enjoy some rights, but not too many. All this stuff with Qatar, insisting that they close down Al Jazeera, stop their contacts with Iran. The Americans have a huge naval base in Qatar, so I think that that was also something that the U.S. was not particularly happy with. But they didn't say anything. They didn't say anything when they detained all those people, many of whom have massive investments in the U.S. Didn't say anything when he rounded up the women protesters. Didn't say anything when he tried to kick Qatar out of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And so I guess they thought they wouldn't say anything when they killed Khashoggi. And that, I think, was a much higher, so that, that was kind of, pardon the pun, the straw that broke the camel's back. So Saudi Arabia is not in the same position as it was a few months ago, and you're seeing this now in Yemen, where Congress basically said we're not going to support any weapons that will be used to fight the Houthis and sort of escalate this humanitarian crisis. Yemen is a mess. We don't read about it, we don't see it, but it's just, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen right now is as bad as it is in Syria. And the rate at which Yemen is sustaining civilian casualties is higher. And Yemen is also a big country. Yemen's also a country with over 20 million people. Because a lot of people don't think, so Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, you say them all in the same breath. Those are little ones. Little Emirates have about 1.5 to 3 million people each. Some of the other countries are big countries, and Yemen is one of those countries. So the Egyptians, now you have an intra-Sunni split, right? So within the Sunni population, you have what I call Sunni moderates and Sunni radicals. So Sunni radicals would be Al-Qaeda, would be Hamas, would be the Muslim Brotherhood, would be Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, certainly. They don't have territory anymore, but they're still a very real fighting force, and I think that you're going to see ISIS 2.0 pretty soon, and that's scary. I just have no idea what configuration it's going to take. But within the Arab world, you have, within the Muslim world, Turkey's not an Arab country, within the Sunni Muslim world, you have a schism now that's focused on opposition or acceptance of the Muslim Brotherhood. So certainly with Sisi running Egypt, together with the UAE, adamantly anti-Muslim Brotherhood, mostly because the Muslim Brotherhood is flat out saying that they want to be they want to take over both those countries. And then you've got Turkey and Qatar, who are actively supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. In Qatar's case, certainly doing it actively. And in Hamas, which is essentially the Palestinian offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're getting more money from Qatar today than they are even from the Iranians. So it's a complex landscape with a lot of actors, and the reason why I focused on Syria and decided that Syria is serious because again, the series of classes is called An Optimist's View, or Perspective on a Scary World. I don't have an optimistic view on Syria. I mean, there will be some stability because Assad's, it's not even a return to power. I mean, he just outlasted the people who were trying to oust him because they were never coordinated and other people distracted them. I often look at the world like dodgeball. Those of you from Israel, Machanaim, that game you play that, and this is where the Chinese come in. I think that there are two different strategies in dodgeball, right? One, everybody know the game? It's a little kiddie game where you sort of knock people out by taking a ball and hitting their knees, and the last one standing wins. So there are two big strategies. One is you're aggressive and you want to get as many people off the floor as possible, or the other is you step back and you're more cautious. And then statistically speaking, there'll be fewer players when you decide that it's your turn to engage in the game, and your likelihood of winning is higher. So that's sort of what China's doing in the Middle East, and China's doing in many other parts of the world. They're not getting into the political mess. They have very strong interests in the Middle East. Famously, when the Arab Spring, or I hate that word. I mean, they basically ripped off 1848, when they had Springtime of Nations, and that didn't end so well either. But when Europe found its sort of voice of nationhood, and then in 1968 you had the Prague Spring. That didn't end, ultimately it was fine, but it was another 20 years before Czechoslovakia leaves budding from its spring. But the Arab Spring is also either an Islamic spring, if you're an Islamist, and believe that fundamentalism is good, or an Arab winter, because it hasn't been good for any single country. Maybe Tunisia, ironically, is going to, their democracy still seems to hold something they didn't have before, but the country's not doing well economically. So this Arab Spring has not sort of gone well, but the Chinese and the Russians were the first to veto UN resolutions against Assad at the very beginning. They protected him. The Russians, for reasons we understand. The Chinese, basically because they wanted, and they didn't have to. You only need one country to veto a Security Council resolution. They had oil interests, they had economic interests, and it's all about the economics. They have a military base in Djibouti. Those of you who don't know African geography, it's on the western side of the Red Sea, sort of across from Yemen. But aside from that, they have their Belt and Road strategy, where they're going to help build the infrastructure in some of the more impoverished countries, the developing world. But they're waiting on the sidelines. They're going to see how the Americans and the Russians play this thing out, and then they're going to come in and use their money, quite frankly, to curry influence. They're not leaving their region, but they're just not putting any military might there. They're more focused on their own shipping routes. And look, if you're a sub-major power, which is what China and Russia are, you're kind of happy when America gets a bloody nose, right? Think about it from their perspective. They think they're just as entitled to be a great global power, and they're not. Russia certainly isn't. And if you're a leader in Russia today, or the leader in Russia today, you're old enough to have grown up thinking that they're two great powers, and now they're just one, and you're not the one. So, and in China feels that its global dominance just went on vacation for a few centuries, but that's just inevitable, and sense of entitlement that they'll come back and reclaim it. So I think you're going to see things get a little messier. It's hard to see how they get much messier. The thing that really, really, really can go terribly badly in Syria is if Israel and Iran lose it. In other words, they're now sort of poking at each other, and Israel more than Iran, but Israel has more to lose. It's not like Israel went to Afghanistan or Pakistan and set itself up on the Iranian border, taking pot shots at Tehran. It's the Iranians who've walked into Israel's neighboring country, threatening Israel, and therefore Israel is retaliating a lot more forcefully. And the Iranians are just going to have to take it for a while because the retaliation could be devastating. But as long as Russia is in the region, Israel's freedom to move is constrained. And the Turks are messing things up as well. These S-400 anti-aircraft battalions that Russia threatened to give the Syrians after their plane was shot down by the Syrians didn't get transferred, but Turkey's now offering to buy them. Turkey now put in an order to buy what are the Russians' most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense batteries. And Turkey is a member of NATO. So, I don't know that they got the memo, but if you're a member of NATO, you're not supposed to be buying Russian military equipment. And the Americans reacted. They basically canceled a shipment order for the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter that they were going to deliver to Turkey. So there's a lot going on. It's a lot to cover in an hour. There are a lot of moving parts. I think that Iraq, as I mentioned at the outset, is going to be an extremely critical country to watch. It has a lot of the elements that Syria does, a lot of different tribes, not quite as many, but certainly not a logical, contiguous country in terms of the Sunni, Shia, Kurds, and other smaller demographies that live in the country. They do have a multifaceted parliament with a government, and it's, I think, a matter of time between between now and when the proxy fighting between Saudi money and Iranian money, and maybe even Saudi militia and Iranian militia, take root in Iraq, especially if the Americans leave completely, which is why I think the United States is in kind of has a Hobbesian choice of retaining a military presence in the United States, in the Middle East, from which they're going to get very little, or abandoning it completely, in which I think they stand to lose quite a lot. So, not a great scenario, but if you look at it again, coming back to the Israel, the Israeli element, Israel just launched a satellite. Next door, right here, we have the Minister of Science and Technology, Ophir Akunas, who's visiting us in Miami this weekend. And, he was up at Cape Kennedy last night to watch the launch of, hopefully in a few weeks will be a moon landing, and only the fourth country in the world. The United States, Russia, China, and now Israel are the only countries who will have ever, and we'll celebrate this in April, who will have ever landed anything on the moon. That's a pretty big deal. So we're flying along while a lot of the rest of the world is sort of mired in its own quagmire, but when that quagmire is next door, it affects us as well. So I'll take questions. Thank you.
I've just been reading a book, Churchill and the Jews, which I recommend to anybody who hasn't read it.
Martin Gilbert?
Yeah. And they talk about the creation of Israel. There's a very interesting conference, which I haven't heard of, where there's Lawrence of Arabia. Everybody heard of Lawrence of Arabia? T.E. Lawrence, the expert on the Arabs, and Weizmann and Churchill get together in, I think in Cairo or somewhere like that, and they decide to split up Transjordan. And the arguments go back and forth. Would the Arabs accept the Zionists? And they got it all, a lot of them got it all wrong, especially T. Lawrence, who was the expert on Arabs. He said, no, they'll be fine with the Jews. My question really is, do you think that this was the moment that they made a big mistake? Is this the crux of why we're in such a mess, or was this always an impossible area to go?
Well, I don't know, obviously, but I'm familiar with sort of other gatherings like that, not that specific gathering. Yeah. Churchill, quite frankly, was the first person to agitate for restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine, which at first blush sounds like a terrible thing, but he did it benevolently. He did it because that was the only way to get the Balfour Declaration incorporated by reference into the League of Nations mandate for the British at San Remo. So Martin Gilbert, a great historian, passed away recently, certainly an expert on Churchill and many other things. But Churchill's legacy, I think, by and large, is positive towards Israel and the Jews. I think that none of them were in the position to make a decision. Churchill in the 1920s, when all that was happening, had a role in the Foreign Office, but he wasn't the Churchill of the 30s and 40s. So did Sykes-Picot ruin the Middle East? You had a pretty bad product to begin with. So I think you're asking a broader question, John, and that is the imposition of one set of ideologies likely to work? And I think history has proven that it isn't. But I think that a lot of us anticipate order when historically we've had a lot of chaos. I mean, even in a corporate context, if you look at most mergers fail. Because it's very hard to blend cultures, it's very hard to blend people, it's very hard to blend roles and strategic objectives. So I can't blame T. Lawrence or Churchill or Weitzman or even Sykes or Picot. I mean, they were acting in their own best interests. I think they had very little regard, certainly in the case of Sykes and Picot, or France and England at the time, very little regard for the local population. But if I can say anything about the Arabs, they've always been extraordinarily consistent in terms of rejecting a Jewish presence in that part of the world. Yes?
Where's Canada in this mix? I'm Canadian, so that's why I'm asking.
Just north of the United States.
In your conversation, you just started mentioning it once.
Well, Canada's certainly taken in a lot of Syrian refugees, so it's been impacted like a lot of the rest of the West. As it, impacts the specific conflicts that we were talking about, Canada has not really played a major role. I mean, while all this has been going on, there have been two administrations in Canada. I think under Prime Minister Harper, it tended to be, we'll play our role and as part of an international order, whether there was some need to send troops to Iraq or something going on in Libya. I think that Canada was happy to be part of the family of nations trying to do the right thing. I think on the Israel question, he was extremely vocal regarding his support and wasn't going to, go along to get along, I think was the expression. Under the Trudeau administration, I don't think all that much has changed. You hear things said in the Jewish community that we had such a great friend and now so. I think that Canada doesn't really have that much at stake. They don't rely on Middle Eastern oil. Canada is an energy exporter. They don't really expect anything from that part of the world, so therefore they're not really aggressive in investing in that part of the world. Yes, David.
I'm a little confused about Syria. The thing that comes to mind is whether, with the presence of the Iranians and the Russians, technically allies, in Syria, with Assad supposedly in charge, is he simply a proxy, and Syria never coalesces into a state again, and is always controlled by an outsider, and therefore is dangerous to Israel?
Well, if he was a proxy of the Russians, it would be dangerous to Israel. If he were a proxy of the Iranians, it would be extremely dangerous to Israel, which is why I don't, the Russians and the Iranians, like the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians, on some issues are aligned and in some issues are not aligned. So I think that one of the best things that can happen to Israel is for the Iranians to annoy the Russians enough that they, and it's very likely to happen. Because if the Iranians get overly aggressive and think that they can really establish a threatening military presence, and this I think, I'm not part of the conversation, but I believe that's a huge chunk of the conversations that are taking place between Putin and Netanyahu and their deputies, that Assad is clearly there at the, by the grace of Russia more than Iran. Both Russia and Iran want him there, but it's the Russians who can keep him there. And if the Iranians get too big for their britches from Russia's perspective, then I think Russia will give Israel more leeway in terms of curtailing, not eliminating, because Russia has interest in Iran as well, and Russia is very happy that nobody's getting along, because then they get to be a power broker. I mean, if you want anything done, if you have an agenda, if you have a pitch that you want to sell to somebody on anything going on in Syria right now, your first address is Moscow, and Putin's very happy about that.
Okay, so let's flip to Iraq for a moment and say the Americans leave. The Russians are going to go in there in the same way they went into Syria.
They could, but it's not inevitable. They could, but it's not inevitable because their presence in Syria is not costless. There's a lot of things that need to take place in Syria that the Russians won't, and quite frankly, can't pay for. All the humanitarian relief that would have to take place as part of Syria's rehabilitation. It's not just, just painting the walls on the destroyed palaces. I mean, there's a massive reconstruction effort that would be required in Syria, and the Russians are going to expect somebody else to pony up to pay for that. We talked about the airbase, we talked about the port. Russia has a lot less at stake in Iraq, and Russia learned a lesson in Iraq that America learned in Afghanistan, sort of. I mean, if you look at the Russian experience in Afghanistan in the late 70s and 1980s, why would anybody want to go there? And yet, the Americans went to Afghanistan looking for bin Laden in 2001, 2 years before they went into Iraq chasing down Saddam Hussein. I think after what the Americans have been through in Iraq for the past 16 years, I think the Russians would be pretty reluctant. They don't need it. In other words, what they were hoping to accomplish in the Middle East, and what I was trying to share in my answer to your first question, I think they've already been able to accomplish at relatively little cost. Yes.
What is the rationale behind the negotiation between Israel and China for the management of the Haifa?
Yeah, great question. If you couldn't hear it, what's the rationale, you said, about behind the negotiation between Russia and Israel for the construction and management of the port of Haifa? So Haifa is one of Israel's three main ports. Israel has three main ports, two on the Mediterranean, Haifa and Ashdod, and one in the Red Sea, Eilat. So ports are extremely relevant, and the Sixth Fleet often docks in Haifa and engages in, that's the American Navy, and engages in joint military exercises with the Israeli Navy. And I think you'd be a lot more reluctant to engage in those kinds of exercises if it thought that the port was being managed by the Chinese, who historically have accidentally eavesdropped on people's communications or pilfered some of their intellectual property. So that would not be a happy case. I think that the Americans are trying to upend that deal. They've succeeded in the past when, 25 years ago, Israel was going to sell some sensitive spy plane technology to the Chinese, the Falcons, and the Americans put the kibosh on that transaction. I think that the Israelis are still trying to navigate how to calibrate their critical relationships with the most important strategic partners on the planet. And clearly the relationship with China is exhilarating, maybe in some cases, maybe in this case intoxicating. But if you look at trade, if you go back when they opened up trade in the early 90s, there were $50 million in bilateral trade. Last year was $10 billion. So it's a factor of 200, right? Including the Chinese acquisition of many Israeli companies, including the leading dairy company, including leading generic agrochemicals, and the investments in technology. I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar investments. So on the one hand, one obvious reaction is, look, the relationship with the United States is so tight, so important, so existential. Don't annoy your best friend and your most important ally. On the other hand, you're developing a wonderful relationship with a country that is investing massively in your country. participating in infrastructure projects all over the world, there's no obvious reason to say no. We're not selling them defense equipment. We're enabling them to spend a couple of $1 billion to help us rehabilitate a dilapidated port facility and run it for us. So by saying no, you're almost telling them, we don't believe that your intentions are pure. So you're sending a sensitive, delicate message there as well. So the rationale, I think, is clear. We're getting what seems like a pretty good deal, and if the Americans are bothered by that, we'll try to make it up to them somehow. It's not like the Israelis are the only country or the only ally that are letting the Chinese in. The Chinese are investing heavily in France and Germany and the United Kingdom, certainly all over Latin America. So why should Israel be different? It's complicated, but I think that if the Chinese came and made the offer, I don't know what I would have done if I were the Israeli Prime Minister, but I certainly wouldn't have gone out and solicited it. But I don't know enough about the origin of that project. I'm curious to see how it plays out. I think the final chapter on that deal has not been written yet. 2 more questions. Yes.
You didn't mention much about the fact of Turkey coming in to fight the Kurds, who are supposedly a help for getting rid of the ISIS. And therefore, what is the relationship with Israel now to Turkey? Do they want Turkey to come in at all?
As tourists, maybe. But does Israel want Turkey to come in? Given that I forgot to mention that Turkey is fighting the Kurds, who are very effective in fighting ISIS. So you're right about both those things. The Kurds were probably the most effective fighting force, both in Iraq, the Peshmerga, and in Syria, the YPG, in taking back territory from ISIS. You're also right in that the Turks are not happy about Kurdish gains or successes or being embraced by the rest of the world, because they have what they believe to be a very critical Kurdish problem in Turkey. The largest Kurdish population is in Turkey, and they're led, the political and, I guess, resistance leadership, the PKK, has been labeled a terrorist organization, certainly by the Turks, but also by other Western countries, including the United States. Israel doesn't really have a big role to play in that. I mean, Israel would love to see an independent Kurdistan, because I think it would be a country that would be very friendly to Israel. I think they'd feel common cause with the Jewish state as kind of outliers in the rest of the region. But Israel is smart enough not to say anything along those lines publicly or to be perceived as agitating for Kurdish independence anywhere. Israel, I think, has enough on its menu as far as Turkey is concerned. I mean, going back 10, 15 years, Turkey actually was friendly with everybody in the region, and right now, Turkey isn't really friendly with anybody in the region. So it's been a real flip, and the Turkish economy is reeling. The Turkish currency is reeling. Erdogan is trying to make a lot of noise, and I'm very surprised that just a phone call to the president precipitated the announcement of a withdrawal. But I would rather be holding Israel's cards than Turkey's cards right now. But I think inevitably, certainly as somebody who
They'll look for a Kurdish state.
Well, no, I don't think the Kurdish state will happen anytime soon. I think that Turkey still, for all of its purchases or deals to purchase, is still a member of NATO, and Israel is not, so that's a big deal. I think that the West has a lot of cards that it can play with Turkey. I think that there are ways to, hopefully this is where I get to wear my Optimist hat again. I think there are enough things that the West can do vis-a-vis Erdogan to bring him back to where he started, and that is away from the Islamic leanings that he's done. But I think he's done it out of desperation. I think he's done it out of populism. I think he's done it because he wasn't a very good manager of the Turkish economy, and as a result, he had to resort to other tactics. But I think that Turkey was also very insulted by their rejection for EU membership. So I think that's another carrot that can be dangled out there in exchange for some positive behavior, but that hasn't played out yet. Yeah, one more question. Stephen. Well, I'll take, all right, okay.
The comment and the question. The comment is, I gotta congratulate you. I think this is one of the best historical surveys I've heard on Syria. You've covered so much ground. It's just been partially answered my question, which was about Erdogan. He's one of the worst SOBs anywhere. So it's funny. It was almost like a joke the way you said Trump was on the phone with him. He said, "Get out of Syria." He got out of Syria. It's a bit hard to understand why America's policy, is so flippant towards this very evil man who's done some very terrible things in this country. In fact, Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is a great French public intellectual, has written extensively about the Kurds at Turkey and the great damage that the West is doing by not supporting the Kurds and how much they deserve our support. But I wonder if you could just explain what I don't understand about the American relationship with Turkey and Erdogan and why Trump did it in such a facile manner. Just listen to Erdogan. Just want to.
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words, and thank you for your friendship and your mentorship for so many years. So if I say anything of value, it's because I've learned a lot of it from you. Back to your question about Erdogan specifically. Look, you asked several questions in one, but I'll try to at least address what I see as two separate questions. One is the relationship between Trump and Erdogan, and that is, two strong men liking each other. If you think about their personalities, if you think about the narcissism is a loaded term, but it's probably not completely inappropriate, right? I mean, they have this view of themselves that that's consistent with one another, and therefore they feel they can make a deal. I can deal with this person because when I look in the mirror or I look at him, I see things that remind me of the other. So on a personal level, that's one of the reasons why Trump has spent more time focusing on the Xi Jinpings or Kim Jong-uns or Erdogans of the Putins of the world than the Trudeaus of the world, right? I mean, frankly, that's just who he is and who they are. As far as the United States is concerned, and why we may be receptive to a country that seems to be acting so antithetically to our values, Turkey is too important. If you go look at the world and look at the maps, and I mentioned Russia's size, scope, and location, Turkey's is better still. It's not as big, and it doesn't quite have 11 time zones, but it probably has 4 or 5, and they straddle that critical part of the world. They're a member of NATO. They've got 80 million people in Turkey. They've got a bunch of people in pretty much the rest of Europe. They're starting to find their political voice in countries like Germany. And, as a choice, the United States could either alienate Turkey, in which case, because of the precariousness of his saber-rattling and populism over the past 5 years, and the way he responded to the coup that may or may not have been a coup 2.5 years ago in the summer of 2016, basically got rid of 50,000 generals, judges, civil servants. He replaced the entire Turkish military, judiciary, bureaucracy with his own henchmen. It would be very easy for a country like that to flip. And again, looking around the room here, right, I was alive, but I was little in '79 when the Iranians went through their Islamic revolution and went from being a secular state friendly to the West, Israel's only country, the only country in the Middle East, the only Muslim country you could fly to, that flights from Tel Aviv to Tehran, to being enemy number one. So if it could happen in Iran, it could happen in Turkey. And I think the people who have longer memories are going to want to make sure that they're using more carrots and sticks and they're willing to hold their nose when they have to. That's my take on it. I'll take last 2 questions. I'll take them together and then.
is the relationship with Egypt, the Gulf, Netanyahu visits Oman, the latest conference in Poland, and even 15, a group of 15 Iraqis visited Israel.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know to what. I don't think that has so much to do with the Arab Spring as it does with. Let me take this question. I'll try to answer them together, and then I'm happy to talk about it on that. Yes.
My question is that so-called wedding that happened Wednesday night in Israel with Kahol Lavan.
Yeah.
Can you see Yair Lapid fitting into that group with his limited knowledge about foreign
Okay.
diplomacy and his limited experience as prime minister, if he wants to share it with Benny Gantz?
So that question I'm going to answer in 2 weeks from now. So I talked a little bit about the union at the beginning. Are you going to be here in 2 weeks? Okay, that's all going to be about the upcoming Israeli election. And, you know, I'll let the Israeli people decide whether or not he has the wherewithal. In any event, it would be at least 2.5 years into another administration, which is longer, just a bit longer than the average term of an Israeli Knesset. So even if Kahol Lavan wins, it's as likely as not that he would not get to take his place as prime minister. But I think he's a lot more capable than people give him credit for. I think a lot of people assume that somebody's good at something because they've done it for a while, but if you've never done it, you would be capable. But, you know, everybody starts somewhere. Back to your question regarding Israel's relationship in the region, I wouldn't necessarily index it to the Arab Spring. I think that Egypt is a good example where you did have a rebellion, a toppling of the government. There was a cold relationship with Egypt, but a functional one. The Arab Spring resulted in a much worse relationship with Egypt, and it looked like it was going to get worse still. So yes, now in 2019, we enjoy the... Well, the warming had nothing to do with the Arab Spring. The warming had to do with the fact that because of the Arab Spring, a Muslim Brotherhood-backed Morsi was looking to unravel everything good that had happened in Israel-Egypt relationships for the previous 35 years, and that only got reversed because he was replaced in a military coup led by al-Sisi. Really, the general of the army got rid of him. So I'm very pleased, at least as far as the Israel-Egypt portfolio is concerned, the relationships are warmer, but I don't think that's Arab Spring related. I think that just has to do with the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood that would be hostile was replaced by the military that has reasons to be friendly. Regarding the rest of the Gulf, I don't think it's because Netanyahu changed the odor of his cologne or because suddenly they thought we had a better brand of hummus. It's all about Iran. So if you looked at what I said earlier regarding the proxy wars that Saudi and Iran have been fighting in the region for almost 40 years, I think that because the Iranians are getting stronger, the Gulf countries that Israel now has these seminal relationships with have taken hold because they also need all the allies they can get, particularly during the previous administration where they felt that the Americans were going to be abandoning their interests in the region. Shabbat Shalom.